Webster's New World Dictionary defines the word culture as the ideas, customs, skills, and arts of a given people in a given period or civilization. If you use that definition to examine what contributions those of African descent have made to Western civilization, you'd say they were without culture. You'd find that assumption mirrored in history books, flaunted in modern mass media, and taught in schools. But that information is completely at odds with the pictures you're watching and the documented adulation of ancient Romans and Greeks. Those who often receive praise for forging the foundation of the future as we know it give their respect and identify their inspiration as the cultures of Africa.
Founder of all Egyptian dynasties, but not necessarily the founder of all things Egyptian. Hello, I'm Marty Chitwood, welcoming you to part 2 of African American Culture, A Second Look. In the first part of this series, we discovered, through the advice of Dr. Asa Hilliard, that the Egyptians considered themselves black. We also found out that during the First Kingdom of Old Egypt, there was a plethora of learning and something called the pyramid building age. Now we're going to look at what happened in the second and third dynasties of Old Egypt.
This second golden age here, which the Egyptologists normally call the Middle Kingdom, many things were going on, but this seemed to be the thing that characterized the age more than anything else. You had a virtual explosion of literature that occurs here. For example, by this time you have all different genres of literature, such as the epic story, short stories, poems, wisdom literature.
And hieroglyphics?
All written in hieroglyphics, or metaneture as we prefer to say, which was the African name for hieroglyphics. And we now have many of these texts that you can read now translated in English, and they are indeed very profound texts. You also had scientific texts, such as mathematical texts. In fact, at this very period here, 2000 BC, which is over 1,000 years before Homer, Africans in the Nile Valley were studying trigonometry. Not just geometry, but trigonometry. And we have their textbooks. We have samples of the textbooks that were used at that time that still are present in museums today.
Now, I'm sure there are still doubts in people's minds. Who were these Africans? Surely they had to have some Caucasian blood, some people will say.
Well, of course, I'm sure they had some Caucasian blood, just as all Caucasians have some African blood. So that, there's no such thing as pure-blooded people anywhere on the planet. But clearly, when we show you pictures of who these people are, they're people that you would call black people today. The founder of this dynasty is probably one of the blackest people in the history of the pharaonic reign. His name Mentuhotep. Also, when you look at the 12th dynasty here, we have 3 very prominent pharaohs, and they're very clearly black. We have their images. We have Senwosret I, we have Amenemhet III. When we look at these images of these pharaohs, clearly they could not be mistaken for anything other than black people.
But if it's that obvious the Kemetic Egyptians wore black skin, why didn't earlier anthropologists acknowledge this fact? Cultural historian and former African history researcher for Compton College, Runoko Rashidi, says the prevailing power of prejudice influenced many.
Here's one example. This is what maybe the classic example. You have a guy, one of the great European Egyptologists, or white Egyptologist. His name is James Henry Breasted. Breasted was born in Illinois in the 1800s. Brilliant man. Went to Germany because at the time, in order to be a tough Egyptologist, you had to go to Germany.
Right.
He spent his honeymoon in Egypt. And he and his wife went down the Nile in a boat, and every time they saw an Egyptian temple, they stopped and they copied every visible inscription all the way up and down. Now, monumental task, and it was published in a book called The Ancient Records of Egypt, in a 5-volume set that was published in 1906. Now, in 1916, Breasted wrote a high school textbook called Ancient Times. And in this book, you can see the first edition. He points out that the Egyptians were not white people. He says they were members of what they called the brown race. And he goes and describes it in detail, and it's obvious he's talking about black people. Now, Breasted needed money to establish what was called the Oriental Institute, the famous academic units in the United States, which is connected to the University of Chicago. Now, John Rockefeller came to, can be documented now, John Rockefeller came to Breasted, said, I like what you're doing, but these ideas about race and about the great brown race, that has to go. So in order to get this money, he had to change that. So the next year, the very next year, you can see this too, a new edition of Ancient Times came out, and it says that the Egyptians were members of the great white race. And so it's not like scholars don't know these things, but it's not politically popular. Apparently publishers don't care for the idea. They don't think that the idea will sell. And I guess they figure it's just not palatable to white people in general. Now, I can't be any more specific than that.
The ancient Greeks also repeatedly described the civilizations of the Nile Valley as peopled with those of sunburned skin. These same Greeks sat at the feet of those African cultures to gain knowledge in science, art, religion, and architecture.
This is the greatest building of the ancient world. This is the Great Lodge of Waset, in a city now called Luxor. In ancient times, the Greeks called Thebes, but called Waset among the ancient Africans of the Nile. This was the building that the greatest Greeks, Socrates, all these Socrates tried to get to learn at the feet of the Africans. This is a pillar temple, a learning center. The first universities of the ancient world were among with the Africans. At Saqqara, the mysteries were taught at the learning center around the step pyramid, and later, further down the Nile, at the city called Waset or Wat, Luxor today.
What dynasties are we talking about?
Asa Hilliard, Dr. Hilliard, and others will talk about the tens of thousands that were taught here by degrees. This is the granddaddy of the Masonic order. This is the granddaddy of the Rosicrucians.
You always get the feeling that Egypt was perhaps one of the earliest civilizations, but somehow it came to a dead end. And then the Greeks sprang up and they did everything wonderful.
Do you believe that?
It's not true. It's just not true. The Greeks went to Egypt and they wrote about it. They acknowledged their debt to Egypt. And I think there can be no doubt that there was some influence.
Pillar temples, wherever you go, are the center of learning in this Western society. The Greeks took this pillar temple, inspired by it, and built the Parthenon on top of the Acropolis in Greece. Later, Europeans were inspired to build a pillar temple at Columbia University. That's the Butler Library. And on top of it, each of these Greeks, Socrates, all of them on top of it. In Washington, D.C., the Lincoln Memorial is a pillar temple. That's why we have to strip down to the basics. These pillar temples are inspired by the most significant pillar temple in the world, the Great Lodge at Luxor.
Let's talk also about